Hello, everyone. It's Professor Buzzkill here. We're about to do a show about guns in the United States, and whenever we do a show about guns in the United States, it's always timely because it's always a timely topic in the United States, tragically timely. We're recording this the morning after the shooting in Lewiston, Maine, where between 16 and 20 people have been killed and dozens more injured. And so we want to stress again that this is very sad that we've done a number of these shows and yet they never cease to be topical. But I want to introduce Dr. Andrew McKevitt, whose new book, just out now, is called Gun Country, Gun Capitalism, Culture, and Control in Cold War America. Hello, Dr. McKevitt. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, Joe. Thanks so much for having me. It's unfortunate that, here we are once again, and these are the circumstances in which we have to have these conversations.
Yeah, it never stops. But what is so important about your book is you actually bring up new stuff and new research and new findings about the gun culture in the United States, which I found fascinating because most of the times we do shows on the NRA or we do shows on the Second Amendment and things like that. But your book is actually about why there have been so many guns in the United States after World War II. This is just an amazing fact. And once it sort of hits you right between the eyes, as it does in your book, it helps us understand why it's so gun violence is so common in the country. Perhaps the most flooring thing in the early part of the book I found was you gave some stats about how many guns there were in 1945, in 1970, and now. Can you tell the Buzzkillers about that?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of the things that really kind of motivated me into this project. There's a whole bunch of reasons I got into it, but one of the questions I found that's been left unanswered, essentially in the historical literature and in our broader understanding of gun culture and gun ownership in the United States, is just why gun ownership accelerated so much. So, arguably the United States has always been a gun country, if not the gun country. That gun ownership has always been important to Americans, or at least those Americans who've been allowed to own guns with few restrictions. Nevertheless, what struck me is that by best estimates, and counting guns in the United States is a sort of mystical art because you
Right.
legally we're not allowed to count guns. We have federal laws that prevent us from having gun registries and so forth. And as best we can tell, around 1945, at the end of the Second World War, there might have been something like 45 million guns in the United States. Within a quarter century, about a generation, that number doubles. By 1968, when we get the first federal commission to investigate guns and gun violence in the United States, their best estimate is that there's about 90 million guns in the country at that point. And then, the number seems to double every 25 years or so. If you go to the early 1990s, we're probably around 200 million. And today, at least 400 million, I think, best estimates, 400 to 4. The NRA says, I think their number is 430 million, 450 million. And why not believe the NRA in this regard, right?
Sure.
And so the question for me was, why? That's such an incredible exponential growth in gun ownership, 10 times the number of guns over the course of 75 years, when the US population over that era only grows about 2.5 times, right? So even if we are already the gun country in 1945, something happens to accelerate gun ownership to an incredible extent.
Yeah, I think I remember one of the stats we used in an earlier show was at LBJ actually saying in a speech in 1968, there are now more firearms than families in the United States. And now, in the 2020s, there are more firearms than people.
That's right. And gun ownership is obviously not equally distributed, right? So if we have 450 million guns, that doesn't mean every person in the United States has 1.3 guns or whatever it is. Even if we took every adult in the United States, it might be 2 guns for every adult, something like that. But we know guns are not equally distributed like that. The last figure I had heard was something like 5 or 8% of Americans own something like 2/3 of all the guns in the United States.
Yeah.
Which is to say that if you are a gun owner, you are more likely to own more guns than you would have if, 40, 50 years ago. The number of guns per gun owner has also increased dramatically in the last half century.
Yes, it's just shocking. But, as I got into the book, one of the other things that I didn't know at all and that I found shocking was that it sort of starts because there's this post-World War II gun glut out there in the rest of the world, and that kind of gets dumped on the US. How does that happen?
It's an incredible story that Americans kind of were aware of in the 1960s, especially there's this first wave of post-war gun control initiatives in Congress, especially after 1963, after Kennedy's killing in 1963. And so this kind of becomes news and Americans are more aware of it. But it's something I think that has just fallen out of our understanding of guns in the United States in general. And that's that after the Second World War, there are millions of firearms, tens of millions of firearms sitting in warehouses and still in some cases lying on battlefields in Europe, in Asia. And these guns have nowhere to go because most of these countries have some sort of regulation on civilian firearms ownership, far more restrictive than anything in the United States. These countries are not going to suddenly distribute all of these firearms to their populations in the aftermath of a war that kills some 60 million people worldwide. They can't sell these guns to their own populations. These guns are becoming increasingly obsolete because in the aftermath of the Second World War, there's World War II accelerates as it does in so many other technological ways. It accelerates the kind of arms race of the quality of rifles and so forth. And so what do you do with these guns? They're just sitting there. There is a cohort of young American entrepreneurs who see an opportunity there, who see guns sitting, doing nothing in Europe, and see a population in the United States that is gun curious, that has more money, that has more leisure time after the Second World War. And so they want to make those connections. The figure I write about the most, and who I think is the most important figure here, his name is Samuel Cummings. Samuel Cummings is the founder of a company called Interarms. Interarms becomes, by the end of the 1950s, the world's largest private arms dealer. And, Samuel Cummings he's this sort of like Boy Scout figure, kind of chubby, boyish look. He's often described as a Boy Scout by people who meet him. He's a tinkerer. He's fascinated with the mechanics of firearms. He himself claims that when he's 5 or 6 years old, he took apart and put back together a World War I era machine gun that had been in a local veterans club in his town. And so after the Second World War, he's going to make that connection between the availability of firearms in Europe, sitting there doing nothing, and American demands. And he starts to import them by the hundreds of thousands every year. These are literally, we often have this conversation in our contemporary gun debates about weapons of war, right? We ask, why can a civilian carry an AR-15, which is effectively identical to the M16 carried by US troops, with the exception of not having automatic fire? And so we call these weapons of war. Sam Cummings was literally importing weapons of war, weapons that had been used on battlefields during the Second World War. He would clean them up. His term for this was to sporterize them. He'd clean them up, eventually he had a whole army of people cleaning them up, and he'd distribute them throughout the United States. He'd sell them for retail himself, and he would sell them to retailers as a distributor, everyone from local mom and pops up to Sears. At one point, he was selling firearms to Sears, and Sears would sell them to the average gun consumer. And why, to me, this is so important is it helps create a truly mass market for guns. If you wanted like a quality hunting rifle in 1955, by a manufacturer like Remington or Winchester, that would probably cost you in the neighborhood of $100, $120, even up to $200, depending on what kinds of bells and whistles you have going along with it. Cummings is selling these guns, which are effective firearms because they've been designed for war, in some cases for as cheap as $10 each. And that's going to really open up a mass market for guns.
So is that why we see guns, and lots of them, rifles and handguns, in things like the Sears catalog and the JCPenney catalog?
Yeah, it's the creation of that mass market. Whereas before, guns were, I don't want to say they were out of the reach of the average consumer, but quality American firearm was expensive for the average American consumer before the Second World War. And so this flood of millions of firearms onto the US market, courtesy of people like Samuel Cummings, it's going to drive down the price of guns, and it's going to spook the manufacturers as well. So really the very first, and I mentioned this in the book, the very first effort to do anything at the federal level about guns after the Second World War, it comes in the late 1950s because of people like Samuel Cummings. The reaction here is not that guns are a social problem, guns are a public health problem, or anything like that. It's that guns are a threat to the US gun industry. And specifically, these imports are a threat to the US gun industry. And so it's importers in places like, it's gun makers in places like Massachusetts and Connecticut who are pushing Congress to halt this flood of weapons, because they see this as, rightly, as competition. Why would somebody go to the gun store and, especially if they're new to guns, they're gun curious. Why would they go to the gun store and buy a $150 hunting rifle when there's a $10 rifle there? And Sam Cummings would kind of boast that these are they're guns for the first-time gun buyer. He called them throwaway guns. This is the one where you go out, you shoot your first deer, and you just throw it out in the woods there. And then the next time around, his argument was there's a consumer cycle here. Somebody gets invested with the low-end gun, as they might, with a cheap car as a 17-year-old or something. And then as they climb the economic ladder, they will then eventually buy the Cadillac of guns. They'll buy a Winchester or a Remington or something like that. And so his argument was, and he was making an explicitly consumer argument, I am expanding the consumer market here. I am good for gun consumerism. I am good for gun capitalism because I am bringing millions of people into gun ownership. And, just by pure numbers, he's got a legitimate argument there. By 1968, 1 out of every 3 guns sold in the United States is an import, which is pretty remarkable when we think about how, guns are these iconically American things. 1 out of every 3 of them is made in Italy or Germany or Scandinavia somewhere. And so this really transforms the market after the Second World War. And I think kind of ushers in a new age of gun capitalism, this thing that's been around since the middle of the 19th century, created by figures like Colt and Winchester, Samuel Colt, Oliver Winchester. After the Second World War, it's Samuel Cummings who is kind of playing the tune that everybody follows.
And as you say, and as he said, it's what helps people start off with an inexpensive firearm and then move up to where they might have never ended up owning a Colt revolver in their entire lives. So this helps Colt and Winchester in the long run, because they now have all these new gun people, gun consumers.
That's right. But the manufacturers don't see it that way. They think this is direct competition. And gun selling, at least until the 1960s, it was kind of a risky enterprise because the consumer market was not nearly as vast as it would one day become.
Yeah.
And so you often relied on big government contracts. And so, there were years in the 1950s where there were no government contracts for new rifles or sidearms or anything like that. And those were bad years for the manufacturers, where they'd have to let a few people go. But then, 3-4 years comes later and they get a contract for 100,000 rifles from the US Army.
Right.
And that's a big boon for the economy. And so eventually, I think people like Cummings teach them that they can rely on the consumer market, that they have to target that consumer market more aggressively. And they'll do that in the 1960s. And, it's boom times thereafter for the industry.
Well, nothing symbolizes this more, the dumping of, or the Samuel Cummings process of bringing foreign guns into the United States, than perhaps the most famous gun of 1963.
That's right. We're coming up on the, we're about a month away from the 60th anniversary, right, of the shooting of John F. Kennedy by Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't want to take a controversial position here, but at the fundamental level, Oswald fired a rifle at Kennedy and struck him with at least 2 bullets, right? And so the rifle Oswald used is a Mannlicher Carcano, or just a Carcano rifle. It's manufactured in Italy during the war. I think the one he fired specifically had 1940 stamped on it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a rifle that by the time he's fired it is 23 years old. It saw service on some battlefield in Europe, presumably. And then it's sitting in a stockpile somewhere in Italy for years, if not decades. And eventually it's imported by a company called Crescent firearms out of New York City. I think they imported in 1959, 1960, somewhere around there. They buy it up. Samuel Cummings is actually, he knows everything that's going on here. And so he sort of quite grimly reflects that he's happy he was not the one who sold Oswald the Carcano, or he was not the one who imported the Carcano, because when this comes up in the aftermath of Kennedy's killing, Cummings says, I've already been through Italy. I already bought every rifle that I thought was worth selling on the American market. And so I'll leave the scraps to my, not so much competitors, but the people who would follow in his wake and try to reproduce what he did. And so Crescent Firearms is one of these importers, and Crescent Firearms sells the imported Carcano to Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago, Illinois, which will be the distributor or the retailer that sells this firearm to Lee Harvey Oswald in early spring of 1963. Oswald clips it's not a coupon, but just sort of an order form out of the American Rifleman, which is the magazine of the National Rifle Association, still to this day. And that Klein's advertisement is very representative of gun consumerism at that moment. It's one page and it is packed with guns. There's probably a couple dozen small little profiles of guns on there. And the Carcano he orders is on there as well. It's probably not the specific one he buys, but it's just sort of representative of however many dozens Klein's had available to sell. And so he fills out the order form. He uses a pseudonym, A. Hidell is the name he puts on there, A space Hidell, and he uses that to buy that. And he does the same thing with the handgun, Smith & Wesson, that he uses to kill Officer J.D. Tippit, a few hours after he kills Kennedy. Also an imported firearm. This one purchased from a company called Seaport Traders and out of California.
By the way, wasn't there sort of a reaction? Didn't the public say, wait a minute, this gun has now killed our president, and it's an Italian gun, and it's an old gun, and why was this important? Was there any sort of outcry?
Yeah, this is the beginning of a 5-year trek toward what's going to become the 1968 Gun Control Act, really sort of the landmark firearms legislation of the post-war era. And I think a lot of the story of guns in America after World War II, it hinges on 1968, not just because of the Gun Control Act, but because of everything else going on around Americans in 1968 related to guns, whether it's the killing of Martin Luther King in April or Bobby Kennedy in June, the aftermath of various urban uprisings in Detroit and Newark and everywhere after King's killing. Guns are going to be at the center of political conversations by 1968. And that trajectory begins in 1963 in the aftermath of Kennedy's killing. So at that point, there's already been some legislative effort to do something about guns. And it's been led by a senator from Connecticut named Thomas Dodd. He's from a gun state. He has close relationships with the gun manufacturers of Connecticut, including Colts. And he has been investigating through his juvenile delinquency subcommittee chairmanship. He's been investigating the gun industry for a couple of years at this point, by the time Kennedy is killed. And much of that was driven by that earlier moment in the late 1950s when the gun manufacturers said, people like Sam Cummings are going to put us out of business. You don't want to put us out of business because we are essential to national defense, right? They kind of plead national defense and say, if we have a bad year and we go out of business, who's going to make the guns when the Soviets invade? And so Dodd becomes essentially the sort of the weapon in Congress on behalf of the gun industry in this regard, which is kind of weird to think about the most prominent gun control advocate of the 1960s operating on behalf of the gun industry. But by and large, that works logically because he's going after the imports.
Right.
The imports are going to be the most important thing for him. And he says, we're being flooded with foreign trash that is ending up in the hands of assassins, that's ending up in the hands of teenagers. And, it's going to take a long time for him to get a bill through. And the 1968 Gun Control Act is about as mild of a series of restrictions as you could expect. And for that reason, doesn't really do all that much in the years to come. He's also, he's battling the so-called gun lobby throughout these years, though he is also working in the first few years with representatives from the NRA who are helping to write that bill. This outrage over the Kennedy killing and the connection to this foreign weapon will lead by 1968 to new restrictions on war surplus weapons. So the golden age of American firearms ownership and consumerism really ends in 1968 with these new restrictions on war surplus weapons, at least, because now you can't buy the cheap $10 Carcano anymore. Although for a whole bunch of reasons, that's not going to limit the gun market in the years to come.
But then you go on to explain how throughout the 60s and into the 70s, gun capitalism, which we've already sort of laid out how that happened, turns into gun consumerism. That there's now a new thing that is not just the market being opened up by supply from the supply side. The demand side increases tremendously, and that's what you call gun consumerism.
That's right. And so there are several reasons why this happens. One is in the 1960s, we see the increase in sales, especially of handguns.
Mm-hmm.
Handguns are thought to be defensive weapons, and this is an era of increasing social tensions. It's an era of urban uprisings, Black populations rebelling against police brutality and broader economic conditions and so forth. And so this leads to essentially the arming of white populations who are, in a sense, kind of anxious about the possibility for racial conflict. So you see gun sales, especially handgun sales, spike in the wake of these successive urban uprisings. In Detroit, for instance, I have the numbers in the book. I don't know them off the top of my head, but the number of registered gun owners expands exponentially in 1967 in the wake of the uprising in the summer of 1967. And this is just the number of registered gun owners. Most people buy guns and don't register them, even if they are required to by the city they live in. So we see incredible spikes in gun purchasing as a consequence of these broader social anxieties. Now, at the same time, we get another mass movement, this one a mass movement to protect gun consumerism. We often call this the gun rights movement, but I think it's also logical to call it the gun consumer rights movement, because the thing that the gun rights movement demands and works most to do is to protect consumer access to a gun market. That's why I think, this is way back in the 1970s, somebody called the NRA the world's most effective consumer lobby. And I think they are very much that. And I think it's important to sort of shift how we think about gun rights organizations as not necessarily protecting these sort of abstract notions of individual rights or even this sort of warped interpretation of the Second Amendment, but they are first and foremost consumer lobbies. And they are lobbying to protect access to that consumer market. And so when people like Thomas Dodd begin their work in the 1960s, there is a snowballing of a grassroots mass movement to counteract that, to protect gun rights. And out of that, we get some truly radical ideas about the role of guns in American society. And I think that's going to eventually contribute to what we see as the more radical turn of like organizations like the NRA in the 1970s.
Yeah, this is how you explain effectively how gun capitalism and gun consumerism combine with other factors really to create a gun country. The United States is a gun country. After all, we're a highly capitalist country. We're a highly consumerist country. Consuming is much more important in the United States than it is in a lot of other capitalist countries. So now we have this gun culture and gun country. And I suppose there's a hanging implication in my question there, and that is, maybe this means it'll never end. Maybe this is because it's so now into our consumer DNA, which is part of our national DNA, almost part of our national identity, that it's almost hopeless. And I hate to be such a buzzkill about it, but it does seem to be, the worse these outrages become, the more mass shootings and the more school shootings. Which, by the way, I can't imagine school shootings being tolerated in the 50s and 60s. I would have thought that would just be the end of guns. But now it's completely tolerated. And I just wonder whether, we are now such a gun country that it's never going to change. That was a very, very, very long and complicated question.
Well, and you've joined me in the darkness, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is just, when you look at it from this perspective, rather than, our conversation often revolves around rights and who has the right to access what aspect of the gun market or whatever. And instead think about this as the material reality of stockpiling hundreds of millions of weapons over the last, 30, 40 years. And so what I often turn to is there's so in 1968, I read about this in the book, in the aftermath of Bobby Kennedy's shooting. Lyndon Johnson appoints another commission. Lyndon Johnson, he loves his commissions, going to appoint a commission headed up by Milton Eisenhower, Dwight's brother, to investigate violence in American life and across American history. And what that commission does is it appoints a task force. And that task force is tasked with investigating gun violence and gun ownership and changing gun rates and so forth in the United States. And they conduct the first federal investigation, maybe the most thorough investigation of gun ownership and gun violence in the United States to that point that anyone had ever done. The research director on here, incidentally, his name is Franklin Zimring. Professor Zimring is still working in law school at UC Berkeley today. And so this was really his first sort of entrance into prominence in writing about guns. And the conclusion they come to in 1968 is we have reached a turning point. This is 55 years ago. We have reached a turning point where we have to make a decision now, or we're headed past a threshold that we'll never come back from. We have today a stockpile of some 90 million weapons. That's no other country in the world can match that in civilian terms. We have 25 million handguns. That was their best estimate in 1968. And we know that handguns are, by and large, responsible for most gun violence. Today, it's still that case. It's anywhere around 80% or so that gun deaths are attributed to handguns in the United States. And he says, we have to do something now. If we don't do anything now, we're headed down a road of 100 million guns, 200 million guns, 400 million guns. And that'll be, at that point, it's going to be too late to turn back. And we don't know what a society armed to that extent really looks like. So they had some pretty radical recommendations, including essentially confiscation of handguns. And they said, this would be the most extraordinary sort of private property confiscation that any liberal democracy had ever undertaken. But if we don't do something now, 55 years ago, we are going to be in a place where we'll never be able to do anything because, what do you do with 450 million guns? I am completely sympathetic to people who respond to these incidents like in Maine and say, we've got to do something about the guns. We've got to take away the guns. I am sympathetic to that. But how do you do that? If that was too far of a bridge to cross in 1968, how do you do it in 2023? What does that look like? And I just don't know if I have an answer for that.
And we should stress to the listeners, Milton Eisenhower and the people in that commission were not wild, hair on fire radicals, anti-gun. They are very middle of the road establishment types. You can't get more establishment and middle of the road than the Eisenhower family and the people of that ilk. If they couldn't get something done, then maybe it is hopeless.
Yeah, there's a funny letter. I forget who he's speaking to, but Milton Eisenhower is reflecting on the experience of leading this commission, which is investigating guns, and he says, "You should see the letters I've gotten. I've never gotten anything like it. They're the most extraordinary letters you've ever seen. I've been called everything from Lenin to Hitler.
Yeah.
I've been called everything across the political spectrum," which is, we're talking about Milton Eisenhower, brother of a Republican president. And not only that, but Johnson made a point of appointing conservatives to the commission.
Yeah.
So on the commission was Roman Hruska, who was a longtime serving senator from Nebraska, well-known conservative, who had been Thomas Dodd's sparring partner on the Juvenile Delinquency Committee for years to that point.
Right.
And so Johnson basically said, I want to win over the people who Hruska sort of represents. And, if I can get him to sign on to the conclusions of this commission, maybe that's the step in the right direction. But, the commission falls at just the worst possible time politically. Johnson is out of political capital by the fall of 1968. He's just barely able to get the last kind of provisions of the Gun Control Act across the line, but he's not running for president again. It's Nixon versus Humphrey. So Johnson's out of political capital, and the commission issues its reports the next year in 1969. And what does Richard Nixon do? He just puts them in a drawer and kind of forgets about them.
Yeah.
And though, the people like Zimring and Eisenhower will testify before Dodd's committee, because Dodd will still be around until the end of 1970. But with a new administration talking that language of law and order, they're not all that interested in taking guns away from people who come to believe by 1970 that they need their guns so that they too can be preservers of law and order.
Yeah, that is a major part of the Nixon platform. The Law and Order Party, the Law and order administration. It's not surprising at all that he wouldn't do anything with that report, because the people who voted him in would vote him out.
That's right. Yeah. And so the Gun Control Act is essentially a failure because gun violence rates spike in the early 1970s. Gun ownership rates continue to climb. The war imports are not available anymore. Neither are the imports of really cheaply made, even sort of dangerous to fire handguns. They're not available anymore. But gun capitalists find a way. They always find a way. And so they maneuver around some of the loopholes in the Gun Control Act of 1968, and they continue to flood the market with guns. And so there's a series of more proposals coming out of Congress after 1968 that would, of course, have to be signed into law by the Nixon administration. Nixon is willing to talk about guns, but it's always going to have to be on terms defined by his kind of core conservative base and really sort of acceded to by the NRA. So the NRA is kind of waffling on the question of what comes to be called Saturday night specials by the end of the 1960s. These are really cheap handguns sold in some cases for as cheap as $10. Many of them are made in Europe after the Second World War. They're made of pot metal, scrap metal left over from the war. It's the kind of gun that the metal is so cheap, you fire it and the barrel actually slightly melts every time a bullet passes through it, so that, forensics experts have trouble tracing bullets that come out of these barrels. And the Nixon administration is willing to talk about doing something about that, in part because, again, it's the gun manufacturers and it's the gun lobby, the NRA and so forth, that is saying these guns they're cheap competition, they're garbage, they're giving us a bad name. So in order to protect the industry and secure the future of the industry, we need to do something about them. But, Congress just spent 5 years trying to push the Gun Control Act of 1968 through, and eventually they just got this watered down thing that nobody has the stomach in the early 1970s, especially in a bipartisan sense, to pass another major gun bill coming out of Congress. In part because you make yourself look like you didn't do it right the first time, right? Like, why do we need another gun bill in 1972? You just passed one in 1968. Don't you, do you clowns know what you're doing over there? Maybe we don't need more laws. We need more guns. We need more people. We need people to be able to protect themselves and so forth.
Well, Buzzkillers, Professor McKevitt shows in the rest of the book how this continues to mushroom throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 21st century, to the point where, as we mentioned at the very beginning of the show, we have nearly 450 million guns, and the idea of any gun control, now that the assault weapons ban has been removed, it just seems completely pie in the sky. Is that what you think, that that the chance of anything happening in the realm of gun control is now almost impossible, partly because it's such a consumer issue?
Yeah. So, 2004, 2005 were a major moment where we needed to act and we didn't act. Part because we didn't act because it's the George W. Bush administration. He is very firmly an ally of the National Rifle Association. We have a Republican Congress. And what happened, so the 1994 assault weapons ban is set to sunset after 10 years. And, that ban is, so social scientists who study it say it didn't ultimately do all that much over the course of 10 years, but maybe had it been extended, it could have had greater effect. But 10 years in terms of the lifespan of capitalism, especially something like guns, which, if you take care of your gun, it'll last forever. They have a kind of indefinite shelf life. 10 years isn't enough to really make anything happen. So what happens in 2004 is the assault weapons ban is lifted. Coming alongside that, in 2005, is a law passed through Congress that's known by its acronym PLACA, which is the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act.
Right.
And what PLACA does is it lifts any liability from gun manufacturers for their products working as they were designed and intended to work, which is to say you cannot sue a gun maker because somebody shot you with their gun. And so there had been lawsuits against gun makers going back to really the 1970s for their guns operating as guns are not supposed to operate. That is, you pull the trigger and it explodes in your hand and it injures or kills you. There'd been lawsuits in that regard. But here we have In the 1990s, we have a whole bunch of efforts to sue gun makers, and there's collective efforts by a number of cities to sue gun makers for their guns working as intended, which is to maim or kill a human being. So Congress says you can't do that after 2005. And these two things, the assault weapons ban expiring, PLACA in 2005, it just opens the floodgates for the gun makers. They know, too, that at this moment, the United States is 3 years into the global war on terror. It is fighting a war in Afghanistan. It is fighting a war in Iraq. It wants to take advantage of especially young men's interest in the firearms that US soldiers are carrying in these conflicts. And so you can sell that firearm after 2004, right? You can sell the AR-15 again, which is identical to the M16 US troops are carrying in Afghanistan or Iraq, with the one exception of it being semi-automatic rather than automatic fire. And I mean, that is a consumer moment in and of itself, right? There's great appeal there from a consumer perspective. And we see that kind of appeal of militarized culture going across popular culture and things like video games and so forth. I would never blame video games for the violence, but you see it as a reflection of consumer desire and interest in militarization and so forth. And nowhere do you see that more than in the gun market. And so since that moment in 2004, who knows how many tens of millions of these style firearms we've sold? We don't know, again, because the federal government can't count by law how many people buy these guns, where the guns are going, who owns the guns, and so forth. And the gun makers are always reticent to say too much about what they sell and how much they sell, in part because they don't have to. Most of them are privately owned companies. And so that leaves us in this almost sort of black hole of understanding of what's out there, knowing only that the market has just been absolutely flooded in the last 20 years with these military style firearms.
Yes, and then to wrap up, I mean, the only thing we think we do know for certain is that it's just going to continue to happen again and again and again and again. And I hate saying things like in my lifetime, but I can't imagine any of it changing in my lifetime. And maybe not in your lifetime or even the lifetime of the children of our generation. Well, Professor, I hate to leave us on such a sour note, but it is just the absolute truth. But it's also the truth that this is perhaps the most important, well, one of the two most important books to come out in 2023. I think this book and Heather Cox Richardson's Democracy Awakening are the two books everyone should read. And so, of course, Buzzkillers, it's on the Buzzkill bookshelf. And I just want to thank you, Dr. McKevitt, for coming on the show, especially in the wake of what's happened in Maine.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, Joe. I really appreciate this.
Buzzkillers, again, go to Professor Buzzkill for everything that you do there. Get the book, and we will talk to all of you next week.